Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday night Bible study class. Tonight we are going to look at Psalm 56. For those of you that want to follow along in your Bible. Tonight, while we ate dinner, we didn't talk a whole lot because we were all starving. But we did talk a little bit about answered prayer. And I was explaining that there are, and I've done a study on this, there's a lot of biblical reasons in the Bible why prayers are not answered. But there is also 4 things that absolutely have to be done by the believer in order for you to even be in line for a blessing. And answered prayer is a blessing. And those 4 things are tithing, going to church, reading the Word, and prayer. That's the bare minimum. So if you're having problems with answered prayer, those are some of the things you might be able to try. Hi, Shannon. So tonight, as we look at Psalm 56, as I said in the description, Michtam is the word for the night. Michtam, M-I-C-H-T-A-M. That is a word, and the next few psalms that we're going to do, they're all going to be like in a little cluster. Remember the last cluster we did was I just went blank. But anyway, the next few psalms we're going to do is all going to be a cluster. They're all going to have to do with Michtam, and that is a word that means unbending, unmovable, steadfast. And when we talk about that, it kind of paints the picture of a person's faith is unmovable. No matter what happens, no matter what you do, it is unmovable. And the word for that is Michtam. And we're going to see this in the next few psalms that we do. Now, if you go to Psalm 56, you will see that the introduction says, "To the chief musician set to the silent dove in distant lands." Theologians think that must be a title to a verse or a song that they were using back in the day, because they've got it in quotation marks. Then after that it says, "A Michtam of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath." So they're giving us a little bit of a historical reference here to let us know when this psalm was written and what the circumstances were. Now remember, David was living among the Philistines when he was on the run, and they turned him over, and David will go through and describe the utter fear that he feels. Now this is one of the issues that Christians have today. One of them says, well, the Bible says that love casts out all fear. It does say that. That's accurate. But here we see David is scared for his life, and yet he has faith and love for God. How do you justify those two? Well, I think it's pretty easy to say that we can have fear and yet trust. The love that God is talking about here is a conscious decision. It is not an emotional response. It's not a feeling. No matter the feeling that we're talking about is fear. That's a feeling. Love is a choice. And when you make that choice, you choose that no matter, it's kind of like when you get married. Sickness and health, richer and poorer, better or worse, blah, blah, blah. You're making a conscious decision, a choice up front. And when we get saved, the love that we feel for God, we are making a conscious decision. That's why he says you have to believe in your heart and confess with your mouth, because that's the choice you are making. Which, by the way, I've been looking at this a lot lately, so I'm going to go down this rabbit hole. I have always said in the past that the Bible teaches once saved, always saved. And that's true. I do believe that. However, to make the statement that you can never lose your salvation, that is a false statement. You can lose your... So I guess the real phrase is, once saved from God's perspective, always saved. You say, well, how can you lose your faith, or how can you lose your salvation? Just like you make a conscious decision to love and turn your life towards Jesus, you at a later time can also make a conscious decision to turn away from Jesus and go back towards Satan. Remember, Jesus said in the New Testament that it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and dumped in the middle of the lake than to know the love of Jesus and turn and walk away. So there we know that it is possible. But from God's perspective, as long as your heart stays where it is, once saved, always saved. So the two are not mutually exclusive. It just depends on the perspective. Okay, so we know that the setting for Psalm 56 is when David is being pursued and sought after by the Philistines. And we're going to see how he deals with it, how he goes through this. Now, this psalm can easily be divided into three parts. The first part is the fear and the faith. That's the part that we're going to see both of those displayed at the same time. The second part is going to be destroyer and deliverer, and that's where God makes an appearance. He's going to be the destroyer and the deliverer. And then lastly, trust and thanksgiving. Again, that's where the psalmist comes in and gives thanks and praise. And I want to, right before we get started, I want you to notice something in each one of these psalms. They usually end with David giving praise and glory to God as though his prayers have already been answered. A lot of times they have not been answered. He's giving thanks and praise based on his faith that God is going to save him. I think that's critical. I think that's a lesson for all of us Christians. There's a difference between praying and then that saying pray, believe, expect to receive. Anybody can pray, but unless you just know that God's got your back, it's really just wishful thinking. All right, so verse 1, Psalm 56. Be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. Fighting all day he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. So in the first two verses we see that this is a day in and day out struggle. For those of us that have lived a little while, we know that whatever issues we have, sometimes they drain on us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What happens when you feel that? What happens to your will? What happens to your body? What happens to your spirit? I mean, if day in and day out somebody was trying to kill you and you were dodging and bobbing and weaving 24 hours, how would you feel?
Exhausted.
Well, every day would be a struggle.
Yes.
And wouldn't you be tempted to say, why haven't you come through for me, God? These people are trying to kill me. You're making me go through all this trouble and all this anguish, and all you have to do is speak the words and I'd be saved. Why are you making me go through this? And here David is making it very, very plain. Which, by the way, just to draw your attention to something, the writers of the Bible, when they write this, they use different literary cues. And here, one of them is when they repeat something twice, but use different verbiage, what they're doing is they're accentuating it. It would be like saying, the man walked in the door and he had a purple sweater on, yet through the door he came. The point you're making is he came in through the door. The peripheral is he was wearing a purple sweater. So let me go back and I want you to see this, because this will tell you what the point is. Be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day. All day is the key phrase there. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me. So what David is doing here is what I said in the first part. He has fear, and yet he has faith. So the first 3 verses there, he's talking about fear. And then the faith part is, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. O Most High. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. And there is the conundrum that I was talking about earlier. If love casts out all fear, how can David say, when I am afraid, I trust in you?
Would it be that he's just saying it to himself?
Well, but look at the context. He says, whenever, so that means in the future, right? Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. It doesn't say I do or I have. It says I will. So what David is saying very plainly here is, I have made a decision. And that decision is, whenever I'm afraid, I will trust you. Okay?
Okay.
So we see very plainly that it is biblical, and it is all right for Christians to be afraid, yet make the choice to trust and love in God. In God, I will praise His word. In God, I have put my faith. I will not fear. Okay, there's that literary turn again. In verse 4 it says, in God I will praise His word. In God I have put my trust. So the point here is in God. And then it ends with saying, I will not fear. So now he's drawing the line. He's saying, so when I trust in you and I praise your word, I have, meaning when he gets to that position, he's already put his trust in you, I will not fear. Do you see the point? When we're talking about trust, he's made the decision, in the previous verses, he made the decision that whenever I'm afraid, I will trust in you. Now we're coming down to where the rubber meets the road, and he says, in God I have put my trust, which means now he's in the trouble and he's already done that. Then he says, I will not fear. Because now that I'm in the thick of it, I know you got my back. All right? What can flesh do to me? What do you think that means? I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? What David is saying here is the fear that I have will be for my physical being, my body. But when I put my trust in God, what are they going to do? All they can do is kill my body or torture my body. What can flesh do to me? Right. All day, and here we go again, all day they twist my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather together. They hide. They mark my steps. When they lie in wait for my life, shall they escape my iniquity? In anger cast down the peoples, O God. You know, when I read this, I think I told you guys a story about the guy at my work that was trying to get me fired. And I went home on my lunch hour and prayed about it. I went back and he started back on me. And it got really, really violent. He got an inch away from my face, yelling and screaming. And this guy had been in prison for assaulting a cop, actually. And I, for some reason, it was only because I prayed, I'm sure of it. I had no fear. And I stood right there in my path and looked at him. And then I was very kind, almost to a sarcastic fault. When he got all done, I said, "Is that all before I go? Can I do anything else for you?" And he went absolutely berserk. And he said, "Just get out, just get out." So, but all day, every day, there was a group of them that had been plotting and planning, and that was part of this little clique's thing. They would get together and they would badmouth. They would pick out a person. They would badmouth them for about 6 months, and then the boss would be sucked in, and then they'd get fired. Well, it was my turn. They were trying to get me fired, so they were all talking together all day, every day, plotting and lying and cheating and scheming. And then when it came push to shove, and I just said, "God, this is on you. I got nothing here." I survived that only because, by the grace of God, I had a witness. And they went and interviewed the witness. And she backed my story and not his. Several months later, that same guy that came after me got fired from the job, lost his apartment, lost his salary, lost his job, and got no reference because of something he had done. So, when I think about they gather together. That happened. They hide, they mark my steps. They did that to me too. When they lie and wait for my life. Well, it wasn't my life, but my job. Mm-hmm. Shall they escape by lying or inequity? Because this guy was lying. In anger, cast down the peoples, O God. Here's a truth that I learned through that whole incident. Because when I prayed at the time, I said, "God, this is on you, I got nothing. I got nothing." And I let it go. God totally took that. God's idea of justice is totally different than ours. As much as I did not care for that individual, I hated to see him lose his apartment, his livelihood, his pay, his job. He lost everything. And I hated that for him. But God's idea of justice is different. This is exactly how God does things. So what I learned from that is, from now on, whenever I turn somebody over to God, I always say, "God, I got nothing, but," don't stop listening, "but
Bless them.
I pray for mercy for them."
Yeah.
Because if I ever wrong somebody, I would fully expect the same treatment, but I would hope that I would receive mercy. But I can tell you from personal experience, this is still true today as it was in David's day. God still takes care of his people exactly like this.
Yeah.
You number my wanderings, put my tears in. Okay, so here's where the second part starts. Destroyer and deliverer. Okay, so David, in the first part, what we've talked about is David being scared and in faith and trying to draw that parallel and the dichotomy at the same time. Now we're going to talk about where he turns it over to God, and God is going to deal with this.
What verse is this?
8.
Okay.
He says, "You number my wanderings, put my tears in your bottle." What does that mean? Have you ever heard that, "put my tears in your bottle"? There used to be a story where it said when you die and go to heaven, God's got every tear you ever shed in a bottle. What does that mean?
He knows everything that you have been through
Well, when do you cry?
when you hurt.
When you hurt. So if you put the tears into a bottle, that means you know every time that person has been hurt and you have saved it and you have collected it. So you've got it right there in front of you to remind you. And then he says, are they not in your book? When I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. Which reminds me again, another story. The same guy that was after me before that story happened, he was not a Christian, by the way, far from. In fact, I was the only Christian in the office. We were all sitting in the office one day, and they were talking about football, which was fine, whatever. And this same guy says, did you see that game last night with Tebow? And they started talking about it, and this guy says, I don't like him, but I will never, ever vote against him. And everybody looked at him, and he said, and they said, why? And he says, because I have watched Tim Tebow all the way through college. And it doesn't matter what anybody says or does to him, God always watches over him. He is protected. He is blessed. So when it comes down to it between Tim Tebow and another quarterback, I always back Tebow. Isn't that interesting? A non-Christian noticed that. I always was amazed at that. You know, we're always told that non-Christians are watching our every move to not just to verify for them, but what they really are trying to do is to say, see, you're no better than me, you're not a Christian, you're just somebody putting on a show. But in reality, when truth is truth and they know it, like this guy did, he saw that.
Yeah.
I will never forget that. I thought it was great. So it says, when I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. So my enemies, that guy, will turn back. When I had been at that job for a couple of years, and my boss always hired criminals. I never could figure out why, but she did. Well, I figured it out at the end. And they had all been in prison. And every time they came through, we'd had to work together, and they would all use God's name in vain in front of me. And the first time they did it, I interrupted their sentences, and I said, I will pray right now that God forgives you for taking your name in vain and don't do that again. And I prayed right there. Do you know not one person out of the many that came through there ever repeated that in front of me again?
Decent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. So when I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back because they know. They know that you've got my back. Then he ends by saying, this I know because God is for me. This is the part of the trust. He doesn't say, there I hope, my hope lays in God, or my faith lays in God. It doesn't say that. This I know because God is for me. In God, and in parentheses, I will praise his word, which, by the way, that's the second time we've seen that. I will praise his word. And we're going to see it here again. In the Lord, I will praise his word. In God, I have put my trust. So right there, in 3 lines, we have them repeating it 3 times. That says this is very, very important. In God, and I will praise his word. In the Lord, I will praise his word. In God, I have put my trust. I have put my trust. So when he writes down here that I will praise his word, now they didn't have Bibles back then. So how can he praise his word if he doesn't have the word?